Shalom and welcome to the weekend edition of the Daily Dose of Hebrew. We're looking today at Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 13. In the context that we're dealing with, the Lord has been bringing his indictment against his people, but the people refuse to believe either the seriousness of their own sin or the fact that God is going to bring any judgment, that he is capable of doing that. The verse we're looking at today, verse 13, is pretty simple in itself, has one or two little issues, but raises some interpretive questions that we'll look at the end. So let's go ahead and read it in Hebrew as we get started. V'ha navi'im yihyu leruach v'ha diber ein bahem ko ya'aseh lahem. So we start off with Veha Navi'im. So we just have our conjunction and plus the article right there. You can see that here with the pathak and the doubling. Nabi'im, this is the plural of Nabi, prophet. So, and the prophets. And the prophets what? Now this is front-loaded. Usually we have the verb at the beginning. This time we have the subject at the beginning. The prophets will be, now this one here, we have a yod at the beginning. We have an u at the end. This is going to be an imperfect. An imperfect is going to be a 3MP, and this is a cal from our good old regular verb haya. And you see the final hey has dropped off here in front of the before the affirmative, so that's pretty typical of 3 hey verbs anyway. So the prophets will be, and probably with the nuance of becoming, not just will be, but will become. When you have a lamed after haya, frequently it has that little idea of will be turning into something. The prophets will be ruach. Now ruach, you know, is the word meaning spirit, but it can also mean wind, and that's probably its sense here. More of a pejorative sense. The prophets will be wind. In other words, no substance to them whatsoever. And the word. Now, we just have conjunction. Another article we have here, ha. But diber, that's not our regular word for word. Usually we have dabar with 2 commas underneath like that. So this isn't our regular word that we're used to seeing. Some feel that this is actually an infinitive absolute, but with an article in front of it. It's a little bit anomalous, so it's not something you would usually see. And other lexicons would actually see this as a very rare nominative use coming from that same verb, obviously, but in this sense, speaking, and the speaking, almost the equivalent of dabar, the word. And there's actually a couple of medieval manuscripts that actually, Hebrew manuscripts, and the Septuagint as well, that seem to have read dabar with this pointing, which would be the same consonants. It doesn't change the meaning of what we're looking at. And the word or the speaking, there is not in them. So the prophets will become wind, and the word, probably the idea of the word of the Lord, is not in them. In other words, the word that authoritatively comes from God is not really in them. And thus, it will be done to them. Now, what do we have over here with this verb here? We have a yod at the beginning. This is going to be an imperfect. And it's going to be a 3ms. But watch out, this is a nifal. You can tell it's a nifal because you have this comment underneath the first consonant of the root. Usually you'd have the dagish of the nifal in that consonant and a hirak over here, but since we can't put the dagish in the ayin, we're going to compensatorily lengthen the vowel into a full sere. So this is not it will do, but it will be done to them. Thus, it will be done. What is the it? Is it probably the judgment that the prophets have been announcing? Something will be done to them. In other words, what they're announcing against other people may come back against themselves. Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward in its translation. Now, I want you the title work here, and I want you to look carefully at 2 translations, which are actually from the same family here, because they're sort of interesting. So. One is from the RSV and one is from the New Revised Standard Version. Now, if you look at them, there's very little difference between these two. And I've gone back and picked up verse 12 as well as verse 13. Because in verse 12, the people, God says, this is what the people have been saying. They have spoken falsely of the Lord and have said, He will do nothing. Probably referring to God. No evil will come upon us, nor shall we see sword or famine. And the New RSV says basically the same thing. The one difference, which you may not see at first glance, is this. If we read verse 13, the prophets will become wind, the word is not in them, thus it shall be done to them. And end quote. The quote began here with what the people are saying, and the quote ends here. The new RSV just moved that quote marks over here. So they have the people saying this, but the quote ending there. Okay, so what's the big deal about this? Well, who is saying verse 13? In the RSV, verse 13 is the people. Sorry, a little bit tricky writing with this tablet. The people are saying verse 13, and the prophets, to whom does prophets refer? Well, this refers to either Jeremiah or to God himself. Godly prophets wouldn't refer to God himself, but they'd be Jeremiah and the other prophets who are sent from God. These are God's prophets. And the people are saying Jeremiah and the other prophets of his day, the godly prophets, they will become wind. The word is not in them, thus it shall be done to them. So they're refusing to accept Jeremiah's message that God has given to Jeremiah and the other prophets of his day, like Zephaniah and those who lived about the same time he did. In the new RSV, the quote ends here. So the prophets are nothing but wind, the word is not in them. Who is saying this in the punctuation with the new RSV? Well, in this case, they're saying Jeremiah and God are saying this. And what prophets are they talking about? They're talking about the false prophets. The false prophets who were saying that no evil will happen. So you see the difference between the two, and you'll actually, if you look at different commentaries, you may come up with contradictory things between different commentaries, and you try and figure out why are the notes different in different commentaries. Well, they're trying to figure out, and they don't always clarify it, who is speaking verse 13. Is it Jeremiah and God, or is it what the people are saying? Is it the ongoing quotation from the people? I think there's good reason in the context to suggest that this is probably a better way to understand it, that it's the people themselves that are saying, the prophets, in other words, Jeremiah and the others, they'll become like wind. God's word is not really in them, and thus it shall be done to them. Whatever they're saying is going to come back upon them. You actually see that a little more in something like the New Living Translation, which is a paraphrase. God's prophets, in other words, Jeremiah and the others, and it's the people who are saying this. God's prophets are all windbags who don't really speak for him. Let their predictions of disaster fall on themselves. I think that's the sense of what's really going on here. And I think we'll see in verse 14 and in the following verses as well that the context sort of favorizes that. I think this is a valid interpretation to say that it's Jeremiah and God who are here and referring to the false prophets, but I don't think it really fits as well in the context. So a possible translation, but I think not the best interpretation. I think the better interpretation is to understand this as what the people are saying, because God's going to rebuke even that in the following verse. So I hope you can follow the little argument here. But it's just a very subtle difference of where you put the punctuation mark, which is not in the Hebrew at all. So obviously you have to try and interpret that from the context. And I think the context does favor this one here. It's a serious thing to not take God's word seriously, as the people are going to find out as we continue working through this passage. So check back with us soon as we continue our study of Jeremiah and the weekend edition of the Daily Dose of Hebrew. Shalom.